we'll take questions for Nick Schneider on corn, Sean Conley on soybeans, and Matt. Okay, the first question that we had come in, it was during the discussion, I don't know which presentation it was from Greg Blondie. And Greg, I've got you unmuted. Could you please ask that question and who you think might be able to answer it?
Well, this is not for anyone specifically, but yesterday I heard the rumor for the first time that propane may actually be in short supply, and I just wondered if that was a ugly local rumor or whether in fact some of you are hearing or seeing that in other parts of the state or other parts of the Midwest.
Hi, this is Matt Tignan. And if anybody else out there has something to add, I'm not aware of that, but I'm also not an expert on gas supply, so the question got passed to me, and I'm not sure about that, but sorry, we didn't have more of a definite answer for you.
The people shaking their head in my room was saying no.
Go ahead, Nick.
In our room, we do have someone that works for ag retailer, and their response was not they're aware of.
The next question is will be coming from Gene Schriefer. So I'll just ask the question. Seeing rotten cob, will this affect winter yield loss? I guess that's probably you, Nick.
Seeing rotten cob? Well, my suspicion is if we have rotten cob, we might have more inclination for the ear molds and kernel molds. I think we'll have that a little more later. The other question would be, is it rotting to the point where it would cause the ear to drop? Those are the two things that run through my mind.
We have one question that's probably pertinent to take right now. That question's from Jerry Clark. Jerry, we've got your line open, so if you can ask Paul his question.
Yeah, Paul, we were just we had a question here in Chippewa County regarding the use of blacklight by some of the corn buyers. Is that any accurate indicator of any of the fungus present or mycotoxin indicators?
So the blacklight is specifically targeting aflatoxin, and so in terms of a general screen against all of the potential organisms we're dealing with, I take that, I guess I would make sure it's clear, or when you go to the elevator, to ask what they're targeting, because the blacklight will help us detect the presence of aspergillus in the grain. And again, in much of the state, I don't think we're going to be dealing with aflatoxin as an issue, and it's a fairly qualitative assessment. You do need follow-up testing if the blacklight did hit on it.
All right, we'll have one more question came in for Paul, and that's Greg Blondie. Your line's open, Greg.
Paul, yesterday a grower asked whether proper mechanical drying can reduce or eliminate either molds or mycotoxins.
Well, we do think of proper storage conditions to help minimize that effect, and that's always why we think of getting the grain dried down as quickly as possible. And depending on what you're doing, if there's a silage related issue versus shell grain, again, proper packing conditions will help. What we're looking for, why we talk about removing the fines in particular, is trying to remove these subtle little air pockets that could build up small little hot spots. One thing that I'll be thinking about putting together is how to, as we go through the winter months, potentially to think about testing some of that over the winter months if there is a concern.
Okay, one more question for Paul. They're coming in. This is a good one. This kind of captures a few questions that have been coming in on the log, and this is from Zen Miller. Zen, can you, we opened your line. Can you ask the question?
Okay, we have a producer that's buying high moisture corn, and the large farmer is combining it at 36% moisture roughly, drying it to 30, and we wondered if, as it goes through the dryer at 120 to 160 degrees, if that's going to kill some mold and therefore help when it gets ensiled in the bunker silo?
I mean, we're still talking about fairly high moisture levels here, which are favorable for some of these molds. I guess in terms of the storage conditions, I'm not sure I can necessarily answer that specifically. I know that one does come up, and we've had questions about raising temperature and everything that way, and that kind of falls outside of my my area of expertise specifically. I'm not sure if Randy could answer that a little bit, but it is something to consider. We're still at very high moisture levels irregardless with that grain, and so I guess the field conditions, I would still recommend making sure we have the identification which molds in particular, and if there is concern, I would even consider the mycotoxin screen on that specifically.
I'll ask the question. In fields with heavy molds, what would be tillage and crop rotation recommendation?
Well, I mean, so what we're talking about here are organisms, depending which field molds we're talking about a lot of organisms that live naturally in the soil situation, and they're just taking advantage of some of the stressors that's going on. Residue here, from a lot of the work we're doing on tillage and rotation, we're focused on actually other pathogens more of concern than some of these ear molds. Again, we're taking these off the field. We need a lot of factors that come together for them to take off each year. The fusariums, the fusaria, I'll focus on a little bit more. Typically in any given year in any field, you will find this on an ear, especially in corn. But we're at such low levels that most people would not notice it. It's that occasional, oh, that ear looked different. So it does pop up, but we're talking about maybe a unique year this year with some of the conditions. Some of these secondary organisms, why they're occurring, they live naturally in the ecosystem, and they're just taking advantage of some of the stress that's going on out there. But I think in the long-term risk, again, there's a lot of factors involved with that. So I'm not sure tillage, rotation, these are things we do naturally without any issues that way.
All right. The next question is coming from Tim Rabine. His question was, is there greater human risk to any one of the molds?
Off the top of my head, I don't have a good answer for that. I guess in terms of if we're talking about just at harvest, anybody who's sensitive to any sort of dust, that's going to be a risk, and I think you have to take into account a PPE type situation at the harvest. You just have a lot of fine particulate matters. Now I know the ethanol plants, I was talking to one yesterday or the day before, they do actually monitor their particulate matter coming through the system. So again, there is a risk on the human side, but I would focus it more in terms of, are you sensitive? I mean, I'm somebody who doesn't have a diagnosed allergy, but this time of year I struggle in the field myself. So I think you have to take that into account at the harvest.
Okay, we have another question. This is from Joe Bowman. Joe, your line's open.
How fast is mycotoxin development in the plant, and does it change if the crop is in the field or compared to in storage or different types of storage?
So if you look in terms of the literature on the corn side, kind of the general idea is that most mycotoxin development initially occurs in a field setting, but there are examples, depending how you're using that after the fact, that we can see it develop in storage also. The penicillium, when we talk about silage, is usually a storage-related issue, and that's as you're kind of taking silage out, you're changing maybe the composition in the storage, getting air in there. So you can see it at both times. Probably in terms of thinking about the current situation for what we might be dealing with, I think most of this infection would have initially occurred in the field, and then it's the effects over the winter months that can magnify or raise or reduce some of the risk.
Okay, the next question we've got is coming from Matt Hansen. Matt, I've got your line open.
You had discussed the when you wanted soybeans for seed production, not drying them down, of course, because it affected germination. But what are some recommendations for drying this wet grain? We know that it's wet in the field for storage purposes. What are drying recommendations for beans?
Well, thank you, Matt. I may have misspoke. It's not that we don't want to dry them down, but we just really don't want to add heat. Generally, when you talk to the seed industry, they really do not like to add heat when they dry their seed production beans. They like to just basically use forced air and just bring it down very slowly so you don't run into the issues with cracking. That's where we run into it. If you dry it down too quickly, the seed coat cracks, and you have an impact in germination. Now, in terms of the regular soybeans that aren't really intended for seed production per se, I know Bill Halfman and I can't remember who else were the co-authors did a really nice job of gleaning information and putting it on that Team Grains website. So for those of you in the audience, and Matt as well, if you go to the Team Grains website, they wrote an article called Artificially Drying Soybeans, and it does a great job of going down and explaining, depending on what the end use is, how to do it, how long it should take, what temperatures you should use, airflow. So I would defer to that just because you can just print it off, and it's a really good article that I wouldn't be able to do justice to of saying it over the line.
Mike Rankin, you had a question, and your line should now be open.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, what about straight acetic acid, Randy? If you're, there's some products out there that are just acetic acid, and what kind of rates, if you want to go that route, advantages, disadvantages to just putting on buchneri.
Yeah, I haven't looked specifically, Mike. We could look into that at acetate-only products. Most of what I've seen, just looking at some of the products, have been mixed acid that would be not just acetate, but also maybe benzoate. I saw some with citric acid. There are some additives that direct more to acetic acid, but I'd have to really go back and look at those. So that's something we'd have to put out there later. Again, though, if that's kind of the focus, I think you're looking more at the yeast issue and then also kind of back-end aerobic stability issues. That's not a straight acetic acid type additive is not necessarily where I'd go if my major concern is going to be mold form.
If you're agronomist, nutritionist, or whatever, you can sign that.
Okay, the next question will be from Mark Mayer. Your line should be open.
Yeah, the question here is there, Randy talked about corn going into storage. Should we recommend rolling or corn prior to going into storage, whether it be top of loading, bottom loading, or bag of corn?
Well, typically we would roll it, and I think you'll get better, certainly, application of these additives. The exception to that might be oxygen-limiting silos, where we tend to can put that in shelled corn and still get real good preservation and roll it on the way out. But for certainly bags or bunkers or going into our typical upright or stave silos, there we would want to roll it. I would just caution you that the higher the moisture that goes up, a lot of processing happens to that kernel just through harvest and augering and getting it into the silo. So be concerned about getting it ground up too fine, because the wetter corn will not feed particularly well. So I want to try to keep that as coarse as possible.
Okay, the next question is coming from Tim Jurgensen, but we don't have a voice for him, at least not on my screen. So the question is, can buchneri and organic acids be mixed together to preserve the high moisture corn?
Well, I don't know that I would do that, just because typically with the organic acid, you're going in with a fairly high rate of those. If it was just a low rate of citric acid or benzoate or acetate, I don't know that there'd be major concerns, but many of these products will have a propionic acid base, and will drop the pH pretty quickly, and low pH does really shut down lactic acid bacteria. So I don't know that I would want to put those two together in most situations. There's been a lot of work comparing the two. There's been work trying to put a combination of lactic acid producer and acetate producer, but I don't know that I would combine those two separately unless someone has done some research and can show you third-party data where they've added those two together and shown that they're effective.
Okay, the next question will come from Mike Ballweg.
What about, Randy, lower rates of acids, 5 or 6 pounds per ton? Is that an effective strategy?
Well, again, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. As I've looked at the data, I could not find really much research with straight propionic acid where people went into a silo. Certainly, if you're not going into a silo situation, I would not go under 10 pounds, and depending on moisture, you'd likely need more. In a silo situation, most of the work that I could find usually compared 0.51 and 1.5%. So based on what I could see with a straight pro, 10 pounds is the minimum. Now, if your objective is not mold and not long-term preservation, and it's more on yeast in wet corn and aerobic stability on feed out, certainly some of those mixed acid products will get down in that 6 per pound per ton range. Again, I'd want to be working with a specific supplier, try to get their research base where they've done comparisons at different rates. The other thing is, keep in mind, there's certainly pressure on using lower rates because of price. At some point, you're going to cut that rate far enough that it's just not going to be effective. And at some point, you can cut that rate low enough that it might actually make the situation worse. So 5 or 6 pounds, if I'm just looking for aerobic stability and yeast control with a mixed acid product, is about as low as I'd want to go. When you get down into some of these 2 and 3 pound rates, I certainly wouldn't try to cut it back to that.
Okay, the next question will come from Greg Blondie. Greg, your line is open.
Randy, if we have the desired moisture for high moisture shell corn of 28 to 30%, would you still at that point suggest going to a coarser roll, or what specific moisture would you suggest using coarser roll?
Yeah, when all the data that I've seen, and a lot of this was actually done at the Dairy Forage Center, when you get the 30% kernel moisture, you do not need to fine grind corn. Now, when you drop back to 26% and less, then it starts to behave very close to dry corn, and it needs to be ground finer. So certainly somewhere 1,500 microns on up to 3,000 is really going to be adequate for wet or high moisture corn. So at 28 to 30%, maybe somewhere in that 1,500 micron. As you move up to this wetter corn, 2,500 to 3,000 microns, and then if you were to go drier, 24% moisture, that's when we get back under 1,000 microns. So, yeah, I think the experience with a wetter corn at somewhere around 30% moisture would be just a coarse roll or crack. And keep in mind, depending on your handling situation, you're going to get some further reduction through the blowing and unloading out of the silo process, and it's kind of the end product that goes into the cow.
Okay, we've got another question here. I'll just read this one. Can a corn mold that produces penicillium mycotoxin be strong enough to produce a hot bulk tank of milk?
That's a great question, and that's why we have Paul Easker sitting right here. So I'm going to hand this little thing over. So
I've got a microphone here. I'm not sure I actually have a very good answer. It is an excellent question. I'd have to do some checking to give you the better answer there. I can't say I've done any work myself. I'd have to look it up a bit to know what the end effects are, specifically to the penicillium mycotoxin you're asking about. So if you want to call me or send me an email, I'll try to get some better information for you.
Okay, Tim Rabine gets the prize for stumping the chumps on that one.
Well, now that you've said that, I have to weigh in there. I don't want to be a total chump, but yeah, this question comes up from time to time, Tim. If you ask it over the years, I don't know that we've ever seen a good conclusive case study put together on it. Certainly, some of the mycotoxins can show up. Aflatoxin is one that shows up in milk, and that's really why we set the limit where we do for aflatoxin in corn is because of the FDA's limit on milk. But specifically for you to flag a bulk tank through some of the charm or quick test, question comes up quite a bit. Obviously, there's a lot of other ways that can get impacted in terms of antibiotic use, etc. I don't think we'd want to say that it doesn't occur. I don't know that I've seen anything, even in a case study form, to say that it does. But if it pops up, I certainly think you want to get in touch with whomever and let's investigate it. And, you know, probably the first step in that thing, if you're suspicious at all, exclude that feed and see if you can correct that milk situation. And then at that point, get in touch with Paul or myself or Pam Ruig and let's investigate that, because the questions come up many times over the years, and I just haven't seen any good conclusive work to kind of say one way or the other.
Okay, the next question will come from Gene Schriefer. The question was pretty basic. What if ear corn harvest is the only option?
Ear corn harvest, I'm going to assume high moisture ear corn. So you essentially are going to be trying to get that kernel moisture, if you can, down into 35%. That cob corn or ear corn is going to be up close to 40%. I would lean towards more of an inoculant, that conveys some preservative characteristics to it, to try to get that pH drop, using the moisture in that corn to do it, and then hopefully getting some acetic acid to come along with it. If you've got some major mold concerns with that, then I definitely think you could be bringing more mold and mycotoxins in with that cob, and then I would want to go to, as much as I hate to say it because of the cost, a pretty heavy application rate of propionic acid-based product to kind of shut that thing down.
Okay, next question is from Joe Bowman. I have your line open already.
Okay, the first part is, you know, within dairy cattle themselves, is there a pecking order of where you'd rather feed it? Lactating dry cows, heifers, calves? And then can you expand that to other cattle species or other species, beef cattle, pigs, chickens, sheep, other?
Yeah, I think I got the gist of it through the echo that I was getting. But, yeah, I mean, your most sensitive livestock to these mycotoxins are actually monogastrics, because your ruminants can detoxify some of those mycotoxins. So the guys over in my building, Mark Cook, when they study mycotoxins from a toxicity standpoint, often use baby chicks as their model. So certainly calves and non-functional ruminants would be the most concerned, swine, poultry. Then you move up, some of the other effects after toxicity can certainly be immune function related, so I'm thinking of stressed animals. So again, I'm thinking of calves, I'm thinking of some young animals, and then I'm thinking of our dry cows and transition cows. And then I think you move into some of the production effects, and so you're probably looking at your highest production cows and some reproductive effects, so your reproductive animals. And then you back in maybe to non-breeding animals, either steers or replacement heifers that are either not being bred or not pregnant, maybe a short period of time, and then maybe low production cows. But even then, I think you want to certainly look at the levels that you're dealing with in the total diet, and just see if you're exceeding some of those thresholds and whether you need to take some action. But you're exactly right, I think, for thinking about the animals or the livestock species, and then within any operation where that feed's going. And so your best corn, you want to focus, I think, to dry cows and high production and breeding cows, and then the other corn, if you can, disperse it to other places in the operation.
Okay, great. We'll take just a couple more questions and then we'll end it. Dave Fisher has a question. Mycotoxins have been hot enough to flag the milk tank. Maybe this was related to the other question.
Yeah, can you hear me now, Carrie?
Or
yeah, we got you, Dave. Yeah, I think certainly mycotoxins, and specifically aflatoxin, is one that we can flag, and that has certainly happened. And you have to pull feed out of the diet, but I think we were talking specifically about it showing up, a penicillium mold showing up as a penicillin effect through the milk. And I haven't seen that. Maybe you have, Dave. I don't know.
I was talking with Nolan Anderson, and
another question. This is coming from Bill Halfman. I don't think we've had audio from him before. What would be suggested for treatment of shelled corn going into a Harvestore silo that has some mold on it and will be around 25% moisture?
Well, I talked with Pat Hoffman about that. Certainly, to the degree that you can rely on the oxygen limiting capabilities, hopefully that would help shut down a lot more mold growth. One of the concerns I guess we have in those silos is that we can still tend to see some feed-out issues depending on the quality of the silo in terms of heating. So you may still want to look at one of these mixed organic acid products. It's dry enough that I don't know that buchneri would be quite as effective. It's shelled corn, so you've left some of the cob issue in the field. So you might want to look at it more as a feed-out issue. It's dry enough that I don't know that yeast should be a major issue, but maybe a low rate of one of the organic acid type products would be helpful on feed-out.
Okay, and this is the last question that we have. It's from Mike Rankin. Mike, I have your line open.
Yeah, I had a question here regarding byproduct feeds and any potential issues with those, like from the ethanol plants.
Yeah, certainly, and Paul, I think, got into that real nicely. You know, the plants certainly are aware of that, and they will try to test and reject corn, but any bad corn that was to get into those channels, both purchased with mycotoxins or if it was wet corn that didn't get stored properly at that facility, any mycotoxins that go through that fermentation process will get concentrated 3 to 4-fold. So I think, you know, it's something that hopefully each individual plant is taking care of, but you always need to take precaution. And if you're feeding those at very high rates, particularly if you have concerns about other crops on your farm mycotoxin-wise, I'd certainly test that or make sure you've got tests from that plant to assure yourself. So that would be the big one. Any of the byproducts coming out of corn can get concentrated, and you'd want to look at that. And, you know, I have seen some mycotoxin analyses from some of the labs, and there are some of these samples came outside of Wisconsin, and there were some mycotoxins showing up, and so this may be a little more widespread than just Wisconsin. So even if you've got distillers grains coming out of Minnesota or something, it would be nice to follow up with those suppliers and see if they can provide you some evidence of analyses on the distillers that's coming out of the plant, at least until we get this fed up. And finally, that was a good opening for a comment I neglected to make, is that in a year like this, do not purchase corn screenings, regardless of how cheap they might get, unless you've really got some great testing, because from experience in these types of years, real cheap feeds can oftentimes be cheap for a reason, and corn screenings is one that I'd have some major concerns about.